is a follow-up to a presentation that my colleague Joe Eggers and I did on October 21st, 2020. And we are going to attempt tonight to answer a number of questions that were raised during that initial presentation that we just didn't have an opportunity to address during the presentation or during the Q&A that followed. And so with that, we'll jump right in. I will say we are going to attempt to go through a number of questions that were raised. In some cases, either I or Joe, we will synthesize our responses. In other cases, we'll actually go through and read questions aloud and then attempt to answer them. And so if your specific question isn't addressed, feel free. The last slide in the presentation will include our email addresses, and we would love to hear from you if you have other specific questions that we might be able to address or you'd like to engage in conversation. So with that, I think, Joe, am I right in thinking I'll take the first part on treaty education?
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in that from the audience.
Perfect. Yeah. So just to say a little bit about treaty education in the United States. So there are a number of people that raised questions about what is taught, and then a number of questions about, maybe some possibilities for, what improvements we could make around treaty education, especially in Minnesota moving forward, and how folks could get involved in advocating for such education. So first, I just want to highlight the work that is being done by Sarah Scheer and her colleagues. Sarah Scheer is a professor of social studies education in Washington State, and she took a look at state standards from across the United States and their coverage, so state social studies standards from across the United States and their coverage of Indigenous issues and peoples. And they largely found, Sarah and her colleagues largely found that state social studies standards, there isn't a lot of representation of Indigenous content. And where we do see representation of Indigenous peoples and history, it is largely confined to pre-1900. So there's much less coverage post-1900. And so we often think of 1895 or 1900 as kind of a turning point where, we see less coverage of Indigenous peoples in education. And unfortunately, Indigenous peoples become less important in terms of the overall narrative in the United States. And I'll talk in the next slide about settler colonialism a little bit. We can kind of unpack that. But unfortunately, in Minnesota, like most states around the country, students, when they do encounter information about Indigenous peoples, it is pre-1900, which often holds Indigenous people in kind of these imagined stereotypical pasts. It confines them to the past as if there aren't Indigenous people that are, alive today, struggling and thriving in Minnesota and elsewhere. So just to reference, Minnesota, the students would most likely learn about Indigenous peoples, history, culture in social studies classes. And so there is a set of social studies standards that govern what is taught in Minnesota schools. These standards, the current set as of 2020, were written in 2011. They are set to be renewed every 10 years by the legislature. And so right now we're in the midst of that process, the 2020-2021 academic year. There is a committee that's working through the Minnesota Department of Education to revise the state's social studies standards. As of October, November, the committee is still meeting. Those meetings, due to COVID and everything happening virtually, are accessible. There are videos that people can watch after the fact of those meetings, and you can learn about how to take part in some of the process in terms of giving feedback by going to the Minnesota Department of Education website. And there will be a feedback process so that the public at large can weigh in on what should be in the standards, what is in the proposed revised standards. And that process will start at the end of November and continue through the rest of the academic year. And I think the hope is that those standards will be in effect for the following, so 2021-2022 academic year. Just to talk about, we're not in a very hopeful spot in terms of Indigenous representation in education. Maybe some folks that are watching this are aware that there has been kind of a flourishing of Indigenous studies at the university level, and the University of Minnesota is no exception. But at the K-12 level, this is not, unfortunately, the case. And, we can look to places like Manitoba, just north of Minnesota, where there is much more focus on treaty education and the inclusion of Indigenous peoples into mainstream public education. And, my hope is that folks that are watching this would get involved in the social studies standards revision process and press for change. But we also know, and I'll just, as my last comment here, say that a lot of educational decisions are made at the local level. They're made in classrooms by individual teachers who are choosing to exclude or exclude information from their social studies classes or other courses about Native Americans. And, as a parent and community member, you can advocate with your local school boards at your local school. You could work with teachers, social studies teachers, to try to push for more coverage in local classrooms. And so I think there are ways that we can get involved to try to ensure that there's more Indigenous coverage.
George, maybe you can talk a little bit about your own PhD experience, your doctoral program, doing social studies education. Is there another avenue where we can better equip pre-service teachers? I mean, how much is there incorporating Indigenous history into a social studies education for future teachers?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Joe. So as Joe mentioned, I've done a lot of work at the University of Minnesota in training new social studies teachers who are going to be entering into the profession and into classrooms. And Minnesota social studies teachers are required to take one college level course on state Indigenous history, so history of largely the Dakota and Ojibwe peoples. These courses vary, right, in their quality and the content. And so, I've seen my social studies candidates have, varying degrees of exposure to Indigenous history, despite, the requirement that they take a course. I think, again, we can look to Manitoba and the requirements that teachers there, or pre-service teachers, as they're often called, are called upon to take much more Indigenous history and to think about not only just the history, but also how that translates into practice within their curricula and classrooms. So how do they transfer that history into lesson plans and, use that in classrooms with young people? Wisconsin is also a great example of a state that there is a law, act, it's called Act 31, that was passed in the late 1980s that mandates that all students in Wisconsin learn about Indigenous history at every grade level, every year that they're in school. And it also mandates that teachers are, taught Indigenous history and are exposed to this. And, it's a requirement for licensure and relicensure within the state. And unfortunately, Minnesota, we don't yet have a law like that. But again, this is another avenue for folks who are interested in advocating for more treaty education and Indigenous inclusion in education to advocate for, stronger legislation that would mandate that all teachers have, more exposure, quality exposure to, the history of Indigenous peoples in the state and across the country.
Sorry, George, to put you on the spot again, but there were a lot of questions about education. And since you're the expert, someone did ask about how much really Indigenous education really should be taught along other history or taught within the classrooms. And I know you probably can't speak for all teachers across all fields, but in your own experience, being a teacher for more than a decade now, how much Indigenous history, Indigenous content do you incorporate into your classroom lessons?
Yeah, and so I'll say, I mean, again, I think this would come down to individual teachers, and I can certainly speak for myself in my classroom, but the answer is quite a bit. And I can say, you know, in my development as a teacher, over the last decade, I started out barely touching on Indigenous history and culture in my classes. And the amount that, I touch on has steadily increased over the years. But I think what's more important than maybe simply just the inclusion is how teachers include Indigenous narratives into their classrooms. And I think often, I like to think of textbooks and how Indigenous narratives within an American history textbook might be relegated in some cases to call-out boxes, to kind of special sections at the end of chapters or the beginning of chapters. And I really think it's important, I've seen so many teachers do this as well, that we're going to, pause in our narrative of American history and teach a lesson for a day or maybe two on, Indigenous peoples from whatever time period that we might be studying. And I think it's so important that teachers think about how to weave these narratives into, of Indigenous history and culture into the narratives that they're developing within their classroom. Indigenous history is American history. And I think too often we kind of separate these things, apart from one another and say, okay, we're going to present this narrative of American history, and then we have this other narrative of Indigenous history that we're going to present somewhat extra to the kind of official narrative that one develops in a classroom. And so if we move on and take a look at some questions that were raised around the theory that we talked about in the presentation, settler colonialism, I just want to reiterate again that settler colonialism is a theory, and it's a theory that I think many Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars and activists and educators have found useful for understanding the history of the United States, and especially how Indigenous and African American people in particular are positioned within our society in the United States. And so I won't run back through the theory of settler colonialism, but just to touch on a few things that were brought up. So this triad, this triangle, this model that I'm presenting here is just one of many possible ways to think about settler colonialism, which was described by Indigenous scholars first and then later taken up by non-Indigenous scholars. This idea of using a triangle to represent settler colonial society within the United States is something that I've borrowed from an Indigenous scholar named Eve Tuck, who talks about this triad, this triangle, and often represents in her own work, her own presenting, settler colonialism using a similar triangle. And so someone made the comment about, or broached the question about, why settlers are placed at the top, right? Why, could we invert this triangle? And I suppose certainly, this is a model, and whatever is useful for folks, you should take and adapt this model to suit your needs. I have largely used the model as you see it here and placed settlers at the top, just thinking about how settler supremacy works within and white supremacy works within the United States, and thinking that settlers often are positioned at the top. But speaking of settlers and slaves and Indian, you see these labels that I've used on this triangle to talk about these three categories within settler colonial society or settler colonial theory. There are scholars that they remind us that we should be careful that these shouldn't be understood as identities. And so some people brought up questions around, the use of these terms and what do they really represent. And I think there are scholars that talk about how these aren't necessarily identities, but they are technologies. And so the settler isn't an identity that someone might embrace. I mean, certainly someone could perhaps, or slave or even Indian, but these are technologies of the settler colonial state. And so people are pushed into these technologies and they're used as a technology of the state to, reify and, keep settler colonialism present and active within society. And so people are pushed into these categories of slave. And so this is why we might say, even after, slavery ends in the United States, slavery still in many ways continues through things like the prison industrial complex or debt, or redlining, or these other mechanisms that hold people within these structures that hold people, within this, category, within this technology of the settler colonial state. And similarly, I often use the term Indian here versus native or indigenous. And I know, of course, terminology around, how and indigenous people refer to themselves and wish to be referred to. Many people have many different opinions on this. But I use Indian really to differentiate between the notion of indigenous or native and the idea that Indian is an identity that is thrust upon indigenous peoples by Europeans and Euro-Americans. And I often, quote an indigenous scholar, saying that, before 1492, there were no Indians, right? This is an identity that is thrust upon Native Americans or indigenous peoples. And maybe one last question that was brought up around settler colonialism is my use of imagery here. And someone mentioned that these images, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, have been discussed as, very problematic, as racist. These depictions of Native Americans or African Americans used in advertising and sports logos. And certainly that is the case, right? That these are racist images that have been, taken up and used and recreated in our society over, hundreds of years at this point. Certainly there have been debates about removing them, and even instances where, like the Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's, right, these images have been removed from packaging and from advertising. And I think, the person who brought up the question asked, why am I still using these if it's largely, been agreed upon that these are racist symbols? And I think, yes, there is merit to this question. And I think I'm using them given the length of our presentation and the familiarity that many people still have with such images, that I think it helps to reinforce settler colonialism. For people that aren't maybe familiar with settler colonial theory, this is a way to kind of get people to understand it in a very quick sense and neat sense within this presentation that we did. But also, I want to just make a comment that I think, yes, there has been a movement to remove a lot of these images from society, but I don't think that that does much to unsettle, if I could use that word, or to destabilize, to uproot, to decolonize settler colonialism. I think settler colonialism is still alive and well within the United States, and just because we remove these images doesn't mean that we are really unsettling. We're moving to unsettle settler colonialism. I think over the last, hundreds of years in the United States, settler colonialism has shown to be very dynamic and very persistent. And, I think I made this comment in the presentation that settler colonialism, we see it shift over time. For instance, we typically don't use terms like savage anymore to describe Native Americans. And so we see these kind of shifts within society, but settler colonialism, right, still finds a way to maintain itself. So you might see this pyramid, this triangle shift slightly at various points as we debate aspects of our society, but largely the structure remains intact. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we're thinking about removing some of these images from society and some of the debates that have emerged over the last few years and months.
And just sort of to piggyback off this, your points there, George. Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's within the last, very recently, right within the last month, it's been announced they would be removed, or certainly this summer. But Chief Wahoo there on the left side of the screen is the mascot for the Cleveland Indians, and that hasn't been a conversation. That's something that continues to be used and promulgated across the country. The Washington football team recently removed its mascot after tremendous outcry for its extraordinarily derogatory term, but this is something that still goes on today, right? It's not just because Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's are retiring their logos doesn't mean this isn't going away. And as George said, this evolves and moves on, but it's still a very real and current problem today. So that's my point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say, I think that settler colonialism, our society, we will find new ways to, indeed misrepresent African Americans and Native Americans in society, even if these ways might be disappearing. There will be, ways that persist, right? And, we see that certainly, with the logo on the left, but then there will be new ways that emerge, right, for misrepresentation, because in some ways settler colonial society calls for that, to hold people, within these technologies.
So, George, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more. You were talking in the center there about settler colonial society using treaties and laws to reinforce itself. And since our presentation last week was all predicated on talking about northern Minnesota treaties, can you elaborate a little bit in so much as how treaties are used to reinforce settler colonial society?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think, and I mentioned this in the presentation, and, they're listed here in the center of this pyramid. And I like to think that treaties and later laws, and indeed institutions like public education serve to kind of keep they give this structure its shape, right? They keep it from collapsing. But I think more specifically, right, treaties were used as tools of early settler colonial society by Euro-Americans to, take land from indigenous peoples, and not only to take the land, but to justify taking the land. And I think these treaties, right, still exist today, right, as reminders of that justification, right, or, continue that justification for the occupation of land, indigenous land. And so I think they really, I in many ways look at treaties as tools of settler colonialism. And I think, as we'll get into in subsequent slides, settler colonialism demands the removal of indigenous peoples from the land. And, many scholars have talked about this as akin to genocide. And I think in some ways, it's not a huge stretch then to say that treaties are used as tools of genocide in settler colonial nation states.
No, I think that's a fantastic segue into this conversation about one of the crux of what we were talking about last week is whether or not treaties are genocidal in nature. And we did that poll last week and people wanted to see the results, and I wasn't able to pull them up exactly, but we saw, based on our audience, about 270 people say 40% said yes, treaties are a form of genocide. About 30% of the audience said no, they're not, and another 30% weren't sure. They're somewhere in the middle. Maybe there's something else. And as we mentioned in the presentation last week, the full disclosure was George and I sort of on the fence, especially me. Maybe I don't want to speak for you, George. But I go back and forth on this. I mean, there's a lot of content within some of these treaties that would, to me, be very emblematic of genocide. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the language that we have within these treaties and some of the problems with that. First, we're going to talk about this idea of allotment, right? This idea that instead of land being held by tribes communally, it would be sold into individual families. And this is sort of genocidal in nature because it undermines the social connection, the social fabric of Ojibwe communities. This is not something that was unique to the Ojibwe in Minnesota. It's something that tribes across the country experienced. And we would call that genocide. Later on, we look at the Dawes Act of 1887 as being a clear example of a genocidal act because of this land allotment, or in part because of land allotment. And land allotment was a part of the language found in treaties signed in northern Minnesota as well. We look at 1855 in the Treaty of the Chippewa. Article 2 talks about selling individual allotments of land to Ojibwe families. And I know that there was a question from one of the audience members about finding more access to resources about these treaties. And Why Treaties Matters has a description of every treaty. There's about 10 treaties that have been signed in Minnesota. We'll walk through them, explain what happened, the people involved in these treaties, but then links to the language of the treaties themselves. I think it's Oklahoma State University has in their catalog, their library catalog, a copy of the actual treaty language themselves. You can go through and look at Article 2 of the 1855 treaty with the Chippewa using the federal government's language for the Ojibwe at the time. But it's in there. And again, in 1887, we would call those policies genocidal. Then we talk about this idea of Christian oversight committees ensuring the moral fabric of the tribes as part of a treaty, as part of the treaty obligations by the Ojibwe. And we want to make sure they were adapting to a well-rounded and morally right, well-rounded Christian lifestyle. And that's something we would analogously find in the American Indian boarding school system that was set up in the U.S. But it's also something from the 1863 treaty with the Chippewa. It's Article 5, right? This idea of forcing Christianity on the Ojibwe as part of a treaty obligation. And so again, you have this problematic language that's found in the documents themselves as part of the treaties, which is in itself, if we saw this language elsewhere, we would consider that to be genocidal. But then on the opposite hand, we have this idea that treaties as rights protectors. And I think it's important to remember that we're not calling these rights grantors because treaties are between two sovereign states. And that issue of sovereignty is very important. As we remembered in the beginning video of last week's presentation, that's the basis of treaties in and of themselves. But one thing I want to talk a little bit about is the Minnesota versus Mille Lacs Band of Chippewa Indians. This is a Supreme Court decision, went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1999, but was about the Mille Lacs Band asserting their treaty rights using the language from the 1837 and 1855 treaties to assert their rights to hunt and fish on land that was ceded during those treaties. The treaties guaranteed the Mille Lacs Band rights to access the land for fishing and hunting. The state of Minnesota said, no, you can't do that. And as protests, especially in the 70s and the 80s, members of the band would go out and hunt and fish, and that would usually result in some kind of arrests. Finally, in 1999, after the hearing in 1998, the Supreme Court sided with the Ojibwe. This is seen as a major boon for Native American sovereignty in the U.S. And all this comes from asserting these treaty rights. So on the one hand, you have language that's really problematic, but also then used to assert and continue with rights. In 1837, we have being used as the basis for the joint management of walleye and Lake Mille Lacs, where you have access to gill nets. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, along with the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, will jointly manage fishing seasons on the lake now. An 1854 treaty used to protect more fishing rights on Lake Mille Lacs, and the 1855 treaty used to protect wild rice harvesting on Hole in the Day Lake. In last week's presentation, we talked about the Red Lake Band using their treaty rights to oppose Public Law 280, which would have ceded over jurisdictional control in terms of law enforcement on the reservation in Red Lake. So these are really important documents, but also sort of genocidal in nature. And so there was a question about, well, is this really the intent of the federal government? Was it really the intent to destroy the culture of Indigenous people? That's a fair question, and one that we as genocide scholars grapple with all the time, is this idea of intent. And on the screen right now, we have the language from the 1948 UN Genocide Convention. That's the legal document that codified it in international law, gives us a framework of what is actually, legally speaking, what is genocide. And I highlighted the really problematic word in there, and that's intent, right? And this is the case when we're talking about whether we're talking about Native Americans in the United States, or we're talking about any other group. It's that threshold of intent, and that's a really difficult hurdle to cross over when we're talking about defining genocide, and it's a very legalese issue that genocide, the conversation about genocide has to overcome. And I would say, for my sake, and hopefully for George's sake, neither of us are legal scholars, that we can look elsewhere. Like, there's been a lot of scholarly work from Ralph L. Limkin in 1944 on that's looked at redefining and understanding how we can understand not only the past events but current events as genocide. And we talk a lot about this in our presentation on Native American genocide that we did back in April. I know some of our colleagues have gone up and presented, and Graham Moran talked about this issue of what genocide is or isn't. But for me, what I look for is other ways of understanding, right? It isn't so predicated on physical violence. And then here we have the draft language from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that would have included a definition then of cultural genocide, which for me does a better job of understanding and explaining policies and acts specifically targeting Indigenous people in the United States, right? And then through this, we can see a more clear picture of genocide happening in the U.S. And when we're looking at, especially post 1870s American policy towards assimilation, things like the boarding schools, the Dawes Act, some of the Indian termination laws in the mid-20th centuries, those become clear examples of cultural genocide. And we do sort of see those coming through in the treaties as well, right? As we looked at language very similar in the treaties from the Dawes Act, from the policies of American Indian schools. And so the question is, well, how are we able to distinguish between the two, right? If we're saying, well, this is genocide and this isn't, is that as clear cut as we usually think it is? And in that case, maybe it is genocide. I don't know if I want to say definitively that it is or it isn't. But as scholars, that's what we're looking at. And so we have these other resources of these other definitions that we're not restricted necessarily to that legal definition of genocide for understanding past events. But it's our job to kind of explore some of these things and pose the question. And I think the thing that I was left after doing this presentation last week was, this is maybe a conversation that needs to happen. There is a lot more to this, and it's not a clear yes, no, that maybe we thought it was going into it. That there is a lot more to it than I think even George and I thought there was as we were preparing our presentation last week. I don't know, George, if you have anything to add to that. We've talked a lot about this, especially in the last couple of weeks now.
Yeah, no, and I think, I would agree with that it's been really, the presentation, it was so helpful for me to kind of push me to think about some of these issues in ways that I hadn't before. And, I like what you're saying about cultural genocide and, broadening our understanding of genocide beyond just physical destruction to, looking at, the destruction of a culture, and even, broadening, I think, from what traditional, scholars have traditionally understood as cultural genocide to think about, humans' connection with ecology and what happens when that's severed. And, we might talk about that, especially with Native Americans in, the Ojibwe in northern Minnesota in particular. One thing that, as you were talking, Joe, that strikes me is this idea of maybe asking the question, is applying the term genocide useful in this case? And I think we often get caught up in the field of genocide studies and debating, is this genocide or not? Which certainly there's merit to that debate, but I think in some ways we should take a step back and say, okay, is it useful? And in what ways is referring to the treaty making process or some of the language that we see in treaties, right, as genocide or genocidal, in what ways is that useful? And does that illuminate a new way to think about treaties and treaty making? And, what would that not provide for us? And in what ways might that not, help to capture, how treaties exist, especially within contemporary society, right, for Indigenous folks. And I think this is where I get caught up, right, in the idea that treaties are so important for Indigenous communities to assert their sovereignty. And, I think entering into the conversation of claiming, yes, treaties, right, or treaty making is genocidal. I think there's a fear that it negates how important these are in the contemporary moment for Indigenous communities to help ensure sovereignty.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with that. I think there was a lot of questions from the audience last week about what can they do to uphold treaties, or what can we do to force either state, local, or the federal government to recognize and follow through on treaty obligations. And I think that's where we get into that difficult question of if these are genocidal, and we're conceding then that they're framed and created starting out from an unfair playing field, by calling them genocide, are we selling out the positive aspects of these, right? These rights that are protected within these treaties. And that's a really good question. I mean, there's a lot, I think that's where the importance of putting scholarship and research into this is, and not so much from a legal standpoint, but from a sociological standpoint, right? There's so much baggage to unpack from here. I mean, both in terms of Indigenous history in the United States, but also then from a genocide scholarship perspective, what does that mean then? Right? We're not only questioning treaties, but we're also questioning this idea of genocide, right? Could something genocidal actually be a positive at the same time? And that's sort of an uncomfortable position to be in.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I know, George, there are some questions that we just couldn't really work into the presentation, to some of these sort of evenly spaced out nice little chunks of information. Maybe we can just go through some of these back and forth and answer some other questions.
Yeah, perfect. Well, why don't I jump in with a question for you, Joe? So one person asks, what prevented a war between the Ojibwe and, Minnesotans or the U.S. government after the U.S.-Dakota War?
Yeah, so we talked about that article from 1862, right, that talked about the expedition going north to see what the Ojibwe were doing, what the response to this uprising, as the newspapers called it in 1862, what the Ojibwe response to this would have been. And we know that there was historical animosity between the Ojibwe and Dakota, and there was a really difficult negotiation, I think, amongst the tribes to ultimately side with the federal government, with the American government. And some of the treaties then are reflected in that. There's a treaty in 1863 that gave the Mille Lacs Band a permanent status then and land around Lake Mille Lacs as a reward for siding with the Americans during the war. So I think when we saw that article made from August 31st, you can remember that that's just a couple of weeks after the fight began. There's this hysteria. Some of the other articles we'd see from that around that same time were saying that clearly this isn't a Dakota attacking Minnesotans. It must be something that Southerners are doing, that the Confederates were coming up here and stirring the pot. There's all kinds of hysteria going on because the Minnesota was so unprepared for this, despite not paying annuities and doing all these things. No one in Minnesota really thought, or no one in any kind of authority really thought that this was going to happen. And just they could not wrap their heads around that this be a coordinated Dakota attack. So I think that's why. I mean, they negotiated with the Ojibwe. There wasn't going to be any fighting. And then there was a question about the citing the source in and of itself. The newspaper article, it's August 31st, 1862. It comes from the St. Paul Daily Press, which is a newspaper that ran in St. Paul from 1860, the summer of 1862 through, I think, 1864. I could talk for a long time about the newspapers of the mid 19th century in Minnesota. Anyone's interested, but it's available through the digital collection on the Minnesota History Center's or Historical Society's website. If you're interested, there's an awful lot of newspapers on there, especially from 1862, and you can see really in real time then how Minnesotans processed and responded to what was happening in southern Minnesota. Now, I have a question for you, George. Do we have an example of settlers successfully moving in and living with Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, so, I kind of, I'm, going through the questions, thinking about, could I come up with anything to answer that would be a little more hopeful and positive? And I think, unfortunately, the answer is no, right? We don't have a lot of examples of settlers successfully integrating into Indigenous society. When we think of settler colonial nation states, we think of Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia. Some scholars have held up other states, but these really are the big four, and really follow the same pattern of genocide and dispossession of Indigenous, peoples. And there have been, I will say, there is some scholarship that's being done now around collaborations between settlers and Indigenous peoples, so non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples in around specific issues. And so this might be around environmental issues in the United States and elsewhere, where the different communities that may have at one point historically or even in the contemporary been at odds with one another about some things have found themselves in agreement about some issues and have worked together. And so this is kind of an emerging area of scholarship where scholars are looking at some of these collaborations. Eve Tuck, who I cited earlier, she has referred to these as contingent collaborations, where, Indigenous communities, especially, she's writing about, would agree to work with non-Indigenous communities to achieve some more immediate goal, recognizing that their long-term goals, right, of decolonization, of essentially reclaiming land, that their, Indigenous peoples, often their long-term goals might be different from those of non-Indigenous peoples, though they might share some, immediate goals.
And I would say, too, the question is, if the question was more about responses or maybe even reconciliation, that's an interesting one where we can look at how has Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia differed in their approaches towards addressing and sort of reconciling their colonial pasts. I know New Zealand has come a lot further, and we hold up Canada as this idealized image of a state reconciling its past with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You talk to Canadian scholars and they say, no, it's not totally accurate. It's the result of a lawsuit, and Canada would have been sued into oblivion because of this concerted effort. That it's not an actual admission, or it's not forthcoming. It's more of a reflexive legal tactic than it is an earnest attempt to talk about the past.
Certainly, yeah. And I think, in Canada, just to say a few words about this, I think especially Indigenous scholars would recognize, how fraught this, this truth and reconciliation process has been, and how in many ways it was driven largely by, the Canadian government, and certainly there was Indigenous representation. But I think many Indigenous communities felt that they weren't adequately represented in the process. And there's been a lot of pushback But I will say, from my perspective, certainly, and then I think from people that I've, met in Canada and, folks that I've read who have written about this, I think there is something to be said about it bringing up the conversations that, again, maybe this is kind of like, we addressed last week, the other night in the presentation, the idea of land acknowledgements, that, this is a starting point. And, the intent is that hopefully we would go further than just simply acknowledging that we are on Indigenous land and that, that Indigenous nations and peoples were treated unjustly, right, in the past and in the contemporary. But I think you see in Canada through this process that the conversation is being had, and certainly not at the level that many folks wish it was being had, but I think it's a start. And, again, I'm not super hopeful just given the nature of settler colonialism and how we've seen it, operate in the past. But again, who knows, right? Maybe we should be more hopeful and think that there is, a willingness to change and opportunity and potential.
Yeah, and I think too, it's easy to pick on Canada for its shortcomings, but really, when you're looking at it in comparison to Minnesota or the United States as a whole, it's a whole lot more evolved and more upfront than it is here. And Canadians I've talked to have said, you look at Minnesota and the conversations going on in Minnesota, and it's 25, 30 years behind some of the things going on in Canada right now. So, yeah, Canada is I think, an easy scapegoat, but in comparison to here, it's quite a bit different.
Yeah, so maybe this brings up another question. Somebody asked about the Minnesota History Center and the Minnesota Historical Society and, what some of their efforts have been regarding treaties and treaty education and Indigenous representation.
Yeah, I think the thing that, George, you and I can talk on a little bit more on is this debate going on in Fort Snelling, right, about recognizing its place as Bdote, as that origin site of the Dakota people down here, which is an interesting approach to start incorporating the native history into something that is thought of as being so quintessentially Minnesota. Right? You think of Fort Snelling, and it's an important place not only in Minnesota history but in national history as well. Including that Dakota connection, I think is really important. And I know I'm talking to some of the people working in MHS about this. It's important to them too, right? This isn't. We used to think, and I used to fall in this trap of thinking of MHS as being sort of this settler institution that sort of codified settler perspectives. But the more I learn, the more I realize that really MHS is in a difficult position where it has a ways to go, but there's also a bureaucracy involved with that to a certain extent that prevents that from happening. But you see that their work done in the Northern Lights, and I know, George, you can talk about Northern Lights and some of the changes they've done in that. Some of the partnerships with at Lower Sioux with site management to preserve Dakota history at Lower Sioux, and then the museum, I think, up in Mille Lacs. There was a joint effort with Mille Lacs, Band of Ojibwe, and MHS to open the museum there. I definitely think that MHS has come a long way in its conversation about Indigenous history. And from a genocide standpoint, they're incorporating that use of genocide, right? We're seeing genocide being talked about as something that is as a historical event in Minnesota. And when I first started doing this work 8 years ago now or so, that wasn't part of the conversation, right? We weren't there yet. We weren't engaging in it publicly. And even in the last few years, it's come a long way.
Yeah, certainly they have led the effort to ensure that Minnesota's students are learning about the Ojibwe and the Dakota in classrooms. And though, we might say that we wish students were getting more of this, MHS is really, through their curriculum, the Northern Lights curriculum, ensuring that students are exposed to, not just the U.S. Dakota War and these other flashpoints, but a fairly rich curriculum of, culture, Indigenous culture as well. And so certainly their partnerships with Indigenous communities and, to ensure that curriculum meets, certain standards, has been something that has improved significantly over the last 20 years. And I would say they're also, like Fort Snelling, kind of at the forefront of a lot of the discussions that are being had in the state. So around the 150th anniversary of the U.S.-Dakota War, leading with exhibits and, even websites and things like that made a lot of this history more accessible, not just for teachers, but, Minnesotans in general.
Yeah, and I would say one of MHS's harshest critics is MHS themselves, right? There's a lot of history to unpack and a lot of conversations that need to be had in the state. And I think MHS, to their credit, is aware of that and is engaging in that in a really positive way. How long that takes and what that looks like in a few years, I don't know. But it'll be interesting to watch and find out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as more and more Indigenous voices are brought into the institution and into the planning for exhibits and things, it's only going to increase that there's more, awareness of Indigenous history and culture at the institution. And then, by extension, coming into the state for all of us to become more aware of this history.
Yeah. We've got one last question here, George, and we've sort of touched on this issue, I think, kind of throughout the presentation. But has there ever been any organized discussions of reparations? Something probably more nuanced or more than a land acknowledgement?
Yeah, so in the state of Minnesota, there have been some, open calls. So there have been some resolutions. Both Minneapolis and St. Paul passed resolutions to recognize certain aspects of the state's history, like the U.S.-Dakota War, and have even at times used the word genocide. And so we might think of those as reparations, but again, I would say are fairly akin to the land acknowledgement, right? That there's some recognition. But to think of, deeper reparations, certainly there are instances of this, state institutions offering free tuition for Indigenous students. And I think, correct me, Joe, is it Morris that?
Yeah, Morris is the site of a residential school. And so as part of that offers tuition for Native students.
Yeah, and so you could see that as a form of reparation within the state. And certainly I think someone who asked a question, was asking, should that be extended, to other institutions like the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, the flagship, land grant institution. And certainly that's a discussion that could and should be had. In terms of other, reparations, there have been some public apologies, not necessarily in Minnesota, but California, for instance, the governor apologized to Indigenous communities across the state for genocides or a genocide that took place there. There has also been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Maine, where it was looking at Indigenous folks who were removed as children from their communities and placed into foster care. And so though this wasn't, the boarding schools or the residential schools of 100 years ago, this was akin to that, right? Removing Indigenous children from Indigenous homes and placing them in non-Indigenous homes and communities where they invariably lost language and cultural connections. We haven't seen anything like that in Minnesota, but certainly, I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility that Minnesota could go through some of these, more focused and targeted forms of reparation. And so hopefully that's something we see, at least a conversation around it in the future.
Yeah. We've done, and I will say just to that point, we've done things in a very ceremonial way, right? In 1987 was the year of reconciliation for Minnesota. We're very sort of apt at doing to say flowery things is maybe too much, but it's things that are very symbolic that don't carry a lot of weight behind them. And so, yeah, George, I think you're right that there's maybe a hope that something more tangible and more permanent can happen. The cynic in me says, I don't know, but yeah, fingers crossed, right? I think if anything, if the work that MHS has done to advance this conversation in the state, both from the textbooks and Northern Lights and some of its work at some of its historic sites, maybe we'll get that conversation going more. I think one of the feedbacks in talking with some of their directors about their work in the public forums and public feedback was they had no idea this history happened in Minnesota. That this isn't part of a normal conversation. So I think as Minnesotans become more aware and engage in this conversation about our own difficult past as a state, that might change things. I mean, we might be more willing to do something.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is the hope, right?
Yeah, in any conversation that involves genocide, I think we have to leave some hope.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a good point for us to end on. This second take at the presentation and some of these questions. And again, I'll just reiterate. We have our email addresses here on the screen, and both Joe and I would love to hear from folks if you have more questions or if you simply just want to engage in a discussion about these issues. We'd love to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, and I would just like to say thanks for tuning into the previous presentation. If you're just watching this one, thank you for watching this presentation. There's been a lot of questions about what people can do individually, and I think getting educated and understanding this history, the story, is a really important and easy way to do that, right? This is an uncomfortable kind of conversation because it is about our history and it's about some of the ugly parts of our history. But understanding that is really, really important. So I appreciate, I know George appreciates you taking the time to ask questions, to engage, to learn, to push for more. I think that's really great. And I appreciate Kelsey and Cook County Higher Education for bringing us on. I think these are great. It's exciting for George and I whenever we get to do something more public like this. Especially me. I don't have a classroom like George does. So on that note, thanks so much.